Greetings. My name's Guy Dauncey, and this is the show Change the World, where I like to invite guests on who share my belief that we need some big, bold, passionate ideas to overcome the multiple crises that we're facing. We've got to think outside the box, we've got to think big and organize big. And my guest today, Matt Price, is an organized big person, right? You have 20 years of campaign experience with nonprofits, organizing across North America, including Environmental Defense Canada, Natural Resources Defense Council. Author of the book, let me grab a copy here. Author of the book, Engagement Organizing, The Old Art and New Science of Winning Campaigns. And you live locally on Vancouver Island, the only vegetarian sheep farmer, and I asked you, in the world, on the island? Tell me that one first. What inspires you to be a sheep farmer when you don't eat meat? I'm vegetarian myself, but I still want to ask you.
It started out with watching the grass grow and thinking that you'd be spending fossil fuels to reverse the work of the sunshine, and that's just silly, so why don't we get sheep to do it instead?
Well, that's a very simple, straightforward answer. And what do you do with the wool?
The wool, we try to give it away to local knitters, and often we use it as mulch.
Yeah, how many sheep?
5.
5, oh, just a small little thing.
Yeah, small flock.
So tell me about engagement organizing. The old art and new science. What's the old art of engagement organizing first?
Well, the old art is organizing itself, which is very old-fashioned people-to-people conversations, something that I think a lot of advocates forgot to do, or forgot how to do, or even forgot that they needed to do it.
Right.
And so that's the old part of it.
So if I remember, I can't say remember, when I've read about, for instance, the movement to stop the slave trade, people were meeting in each other's homes every week. There was no email, there was no telephone. They just had a conversation, then do stuff, and then hold a rally or whatever. Very personal.
Yeah, very, very, very much so. And there's a sociologist who charts the different phases of advocacy, and she looked at the early groups, the ones you're talking about, and many others, even the early service organizations like the
Rotary Club, the Lions,
all these guys.
They're all personal.
They weren't just doing charity; they were actually doing policy work at the same time.
Well, yes.
And so this was the old model, which was highly participatory, which meant
and the suffragettes, the women, it was all highly engaged. Yes.
Yeah. And so if you were a good citizen, you were probably active in one of these organizations, not just doing local good works, but also going to Ottawa or to Washington or wherever the capital was to go and speak your piece.
Right.
And so that was the old model, and that started changing around the late 60s, the early 70s, after the civil rights movement, when you had a couple of things happen. One was a lot of the isms grew, and so the issues got broken into environmentalism and feminism.
Yes.
And suddenly there weren't sort of these big catch-alls anymore. People had sort of segmented out into more professionalized groups. Where you hired experts to go and speak to policymakers, and then the average citizen was just reduced to writing a check. And so they went and retreated to their couch and relied upon the fact that somebody else was going to go and do the work.
So today that's normal. You join an organization, you write a check, you get a newsletter, occasionally you click a petition or something like that, and you sit and that's it for most people.
Well, I like to argue that that's changing again. So there was the second wave where it got professionalized, and this was also the era of television.
Yes.
And so television really changed a lot of things as well, in that politics became about image. It became about who had access to TV or to media, who had access to money, so you can buy ads. And so that sort of became the world of advocacy. Was very money-driven, very image-driven, and again, it was quite passive on the part of the average citizen who was just consuming this, sitting at home on the couch. Right. So that was phase 2. And so phase 3, I think, is interesting. It's where we are now. It's not fully formed. It's just emerging.
Yeah.
But phase 3 has been hastened by the internet, which is a double-edged sword, because many people look at the internet and say it leads to collectivism, this kind of shallowness where people are on their computers.
So we're talking campaigning, whether it's a campaign to save the grizzlies from being hunted, or to stop the oil tanker traffic, or to get a candidate elected, or to change something in policy. So something you feel passionate about. And what you're saying is that if you just jump in and think it's all going to be easy, there's a lot you can learn from the previous people who've done campaigning, right?
Yeah.
And you've encapsulated the main lessons from that in this. So for a new campaign, if someone's starting to campaign on something today, what would your advice be to them?
Start with people. Start asking the first question is, who are your people?
Who are your people?
The thing about the internet is it allows people to be shallow and just click on things, but it also allows you to go much deeper. It allows you to identify a constituency of people much more easily than it's ever been possible to do before.
Right. So tell us a story of how this has happened successfully.
Well, I think the real break in the second model I was talking about happened with Howard Dean in the United States. And so this was the 2004, we ran for, in the primary campaign to become the Democratic nominee.
Okay.
And up until that point, voters had been asked to either vote or donate. And then Howard Dean came along and used this new thing called the internet and said, why don't you come out and volunteer?
Right.
And the first time ever, this campaign actually had hundreds of thousands of people who showed up. And this was sort of like this thunderbolt in which people realized there's a lot of people who actually want to get involved.
Yes.
And so you actually then have to be good at that.
Okay, yes.
And so now that you can use the internet to get people off the couch and back into the game again, you need to then go back to some of the old principles of how do you actually organize people.
Right, if you've got 10,000 people saying I want to volunteer and do something,
that's a mess.
Chaos arises.
Yes.
Unless you've got...
Exactly, unless you go back to old school sort of organizing structures, which a lot of these things were invented by some of the early labor organizers.
Yes.
You know, how do you form teams of people that are interlocking so that you're all working towards some goal in the future?
So where did it go from Howard Dean? What was the next step forward?
Well, Howard Dean flamed out and lost badly.
Yes.
It was one of these things where people were surprised that he raised so much money and had so many volunteers out. And so it really kind of changed things at the same time he didn't win.
Yes.
And so there was still work to be done. So Obama came along 4 years later, this was 2008.
Yes.
And he actually had not just their best internet people, some of whom were actually from the Dean campaign, but then he also brought in the organizing people and said, okay, if these people come out of the woodwork, how do we actually structure that properly?
Right.
So the 2008 Obama campaign is still looked at by campaigners around the world as a good example of how you can actually do this at scale.
I mean, I think you said there's something like 100,000 volunteers was involved in that, or some huge number?
He had 1.5 million in 2008. And
1.5 million volunteers actually knocking on doors or talking to people and doing things.
And in 2012, he had 2.2 million people.
That's huge, right?
It is huge.
That's, I can only begin to dream, that's the size of a whole country.
Yeah, it's the
How
biggest.
do you organize?
It's essentially the biggest campaign or the biggest voter contact operation in history.
So I can imagine to some bureaucratic campaign organizer, that's a nightmare because you're not in control anymore. These people might do things.
Yes, and that's a big thing. It's about letting go of control,
Right.
which is big, scary to a lot of campaigners who are used to sort of buying ads on TV and sitting in back rooms and raising the money. Suddenly you have to democratize your own campaign to say, well, if these people are going to knock on doors for you for 20 hours a week, they're going to want to say on how your campaigns go running, right? So the volunteers need to be then brought into decision making. So yeah, you're giving up control by giving these people agency in your campaign.
Right. And did the same thing happen with Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders?
Well, the Hillary campaign was its own failure. I think the Bernie Sanders campaign was fast.
Technically, it wasn't a failure. She won a majority of the American
yeah.
people. We shouldn't forget that, right?
But she didn't bring people out and energize them and plug them in the same way that the Obama campaign did. And
Yes.
the biggest story of 2016 was actually the Bernie Sanders campaign.
Second to the Trump campaign.
Yeah, well,
Yes.
the Sanders campaign was actually amazing in that they, from scratch and over a couple of months, they built a voter contact operation on the telephone, and they were, at the height of their voter contact, they were making 1 million phone calls a day.
1 million phone calls a day.
Yep.
Holy moly, that's it's incredible.
And they did that all through sort of online channels, bringing people together online and then phone banking. And so they said, you know, we don't actually need this kind of data and targeting thing anymore because we can just call everybody. Everybody.
Yeah.
And so they said, do you want us to call Colorado? And they said, well, how many people in Colorado? I said, all of them. We'll always call them all. And so the presidential campaigns are a bit kind of freakish, and so they don't happen in any way in Canada like this.
Right.
But it does give you a crucible. It's like it's a laboratory for how these innovations can take place. They usually happen there.
But in our Canadian campaign, the year where Harper was running against
Trudeau and Mulcair?
It was Trudeau. It was the Trudeau-Mulcair one, yes. And there was a new thing that happened in campaigning around people choosing to vote strategically. Mm-hmm. Previously, it'd been a few minor people, but it became quite a big thing. Who was organising? How did that get organised?
Well, there was an NGO in Canada called Lead Now that had that as their mandate. They looked at our broken voting system and said in the first past the post broken voting system, the Conservatives won 100% of the power last time with about 40% of the vote. And we don't like the outcomes. So they said 60% of the people wanted a progressive government, and they didn't get one. So they said, okay, for one time only, they said, let's do this, where we'll try and rally behind the candidate most likely to be the Conservatives. And so they had the internet, and they had the ability to do some polling in all the ridings, and they also had the ability to mobilize, again, sort of tens of thousands of volunteers to make phone calls and go knock on doors. And so they, I think, more than any other group, I think, put that on the radar as an option of that election.
So they were using the new engagement strategy principles?
Yes, they very much so. And they were borrowing very heavily from what the Obama campaigns did.
Interesting.
They were using a lot of the same digital tools. And so this is becoming embedded now in not just the big presidential campaigns who have tons of money, but the little campaigns who just sometimes on a community level can do some of this work too.
So I can see if it's a new idea and one candidate has it, the others don't, then it's a big advantage. But what happens when all candidates are using, you just get healthier democracy, right?
I think so. I mean, I think you get more participation, which is a good thing for me. Some of the political parties in Europe, I think, have gone much further than even the American ones in terms of letting people into the party, not just at election time when you're door knocking, but also in your policy, in your platform development. And so those parties look much more like movements.
Right.
And so Podemos in Spain and the Five Star Movement in Italy, they're letting people directly into that process of who are we as a party.
I don't experience the Liberals or the NDP, or quite frankly the Greens, as a movement in that sense of being involved, invited to participate in the policy making.
No. We're not there yet here.
It feels like there's a secret little box where that happens over there, and you just help get the vote out and we'll sort out, but that feels inherently frustrating to me.
And I think over time, I think volunteers kind of feel a little bit used under that model. And so again, if you've put in tons of hours knocking on doors for a party, you probably want some kind of say over what happens next.
Yes. So you write quite a bit about the Dogwood Initiative, which is a local Victoria-based organization which has been learning some of this stuff. How have they been using it?
Dogwood has probably been the most effective NGO in the country in terms of trying to adapt a lot of these methods and in blazing a trail, frankly, because a lot of NGOs are still a bit scared about doing things differently. And so things didn't really start shifting until you had Dogwood saying, well, we're just going to do it. Right. And we're going to show everyone that this is possible, and we're going to go from 0 to 100 quite quickly.
So what did they do?
So they started here locally. They started working in one riding, in Gary Lunn's riding. If you remember, he was the Minister
Sydney, Saanich Gulf Islands.
Natural Resources. He was in North Victoria here.
The riding that Elizabeth May holds now.
That's right.
Yes.
And so they just started streeting and door knocking in that riding a long time ago. And this was before they had really a database or any lists. And they just started recruiting people. And they didn't stop there. That was one election. They went through a couple more election cycles, and they got better at what they were doing. They got better at using digital tools to recruit people. And then not just that, but they were getting people's phone numbers to say, well, once you sign a petition, that's just the first step. Right. The next thing is you're going to get a phone call from Dogwood saying, hey, do you want to come to a team meeting? Let's go and do more together, right? Yeah. So that's kind of it's called a ladder of engagement, where you're escalating people beyond just being collectivists to doing something else in the world so that they can actually affect change.
Because my take is we're fundamentally social creatures. We love meeting other people, talking, engaging, and sitting at home just clicking and stuff is one thing. But once you join a team with other people, you've got a whole other, you make friends. And there's a law, I invented a thing called the fifth law of sustainability, which says if it's not fun, it's not sustainable. And you don't ever much have fun on your own. Fun is fundamentally with other people.
Yeah, and some of these teams, they build in, Lead Now and Dogwood, they build in what they call comfort captains. They have a person who does data, a person who does recruitment, and then someone's responsible for making sure there's food at all the meetings and that people are having a good time, right? So they're trying to hardwire it into the process.
It's possible to have political meetings and the meeting is so agenda-driven and focused and boring, you just go away feeling exhausted, right?
Yeah. And what they found also is that at the tail end, they've gone through a really hard election campaign. Sometimes they've won, sometimes they've lost. But what they find is it's a little bit like, you hear these stories from units in the Army. They come back from there, and some of their best friends are the people you were in the hole with. Right?
Yes.
And they feel like they went through something hard together, and they've really bonded because of that. And so you find these teams are actually quite strong after they've actually finished something.
So Dogwood was campaigning specifically on the pipers and the tanker trade, wasn't it?
Yeah, the tankers was their big issue that they grew on, and they've taken on coal and some other issues in the recent Ban Big Money campaign. And so they very much have a philosophy of saying, we're not just going to win this online, we're going to go and hit the streets, we're going to be talking to people face to face, and we're not just going to be asking them to sign a petition, but then to say, well, if you agree with this, would you come and next weekend, would you come and help me get more signatures? Right? So they're trying to involve more people in the process.
Slight turn to one side, but you know there was a man called Robert Putnam who wrote a book called Bowling Alone.
Yes.
And his premise was that until somewhere in the 60s, everyone was engaged in social clubs, in outings, in doing things together. And then from the 60s onwards, we got more and more privatized and people weren't joining anymore. Now we sit at home watching Netflix. And there's a hidden loss. I mean, it's not as if the only thing to do in the evenings was go out and go to the pub. There were so many other things that were going on.
Right.
In fact, when de Tocqueville came to America in 1850 or something like that, he reported back that he'd never come across a society with so many people belonging to so many things, all of which were in person. So if I hear you right, what you're saying is that it's going back to those old ways of meeting in person, but bringing the new internet digital techniques to help us organize rapidly to get stuff done.
Yeah, and you know, the internet has been a game changer because in the old days, you may have agreed with 20 other people who were scattered around Victoria, but you wouldn't be able to find them, or it'd be really hard for you to find them.
Now you just set up a meetup group and boom.
Well, now you can find them because they have maybe online, they've joined a group or something, so now it's much more easily to uncover that first alignment of values.
Right.
And then you really do need then to go to the next step, and this is kind of where some groups still aren't there yet, which is then how do you get face-to-face with someone to form that solidarity, which happens in person.
Right. And how do you prize people out of their homes when they're just behind that front door? You knock on the door, right?
Well, you knock on a lot of doors and you ask a lot, and you get a lot of no's, and that's part of it as well. We're not going to have a magical democracy tomorrow where everyone's participating, but what you do have is you have a sense of a critical mass of people forming, and even if someone said no to you, maybe their brother or sister hasn't, and they'll come back and they'll tell the story about getting involved in Dogwood or different organizations.
Yes.
And that'll become culturally acceptable that you are involved in these kinds of things, right?
Yes, it becomes normal to be involved.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so, I mean, the Bowling Alone example is a good one. There's a group in Vancouver that's called the Metro Vancouver Alliance.
Yeah.
They are building social capital because their model of organizing is bringing together different groups into the same room. So a union and a church group, for example, and they'll bring those together. And these are people who would never ordinarily intersect. And they say, let's have a conversation. So, you know, we disagree maybe on a lot of things, but let's find out what we agree on first.
Okay.
And let's work on that. We'll set aside our differences and everything else, right? But we'll build this one campaign together based on where we do intersect. And so they have been super successful in Vancouver in sort of building that social capital again and forcing people to have conversations with folks they never would have thought about talking to.
So this is called the Metro Vancouver Alliance. Yep. And have they got some results to tuck under their belts?
They worked really hard on the living wage campaign for the municipal government of Vancouver.
Yes.
And so that was their big request. And I think it was 2 cycles ago in elections. Yes. And so they brought together all of their members and demanded from all of the candidates a living wage pledge. Right. And even the right-wing candidates pledged.
Wow. They felt that pressure from all these.
Yeah, they said this was a consensus right across the political spectrum.
Wow.
So it's the power of bringing like all these different disparate groups together. It's not just some radicals over here, but it's like these are the churches and the unions and everyone's in agreement.
We're in Victoria, and a lot of viewers will be in Victoria. Is there an equivalent organizing process happening in Victoria?
There is, and I'm embarrassed I forgot the name. There is a nascent similar model emerging in Victoria as well. It's, this is the model which was handed down by Saul Alinsky, who's one of the godfathers of organizing.
Yeah.
So he's when he died, there was an organization that carried on his work, and they are the ones inspiring the Vancouver group and also the Victoria group.
So again, bringing the labour unions, churches. What about environmental groups? Are they getting included in the mix?
They are, and it's I think it's anyone is welcome to the table. They're trying to bring people to the table who have a constituency.
Yes.
And so there's a lot of NGOs in the world which are two-people NGOs.
Yes.
And so rather than that, they're sort of saying, well, if you have a constituency of people, then let's get together at the table.
So let me throw you a wild card here. One of the biggest crises I experience us going on in Canada, for which I see minimal organizing, is the housing crisis. People struggling, not just homeless on the streets, but couch surfing, can't pay the rent, can't buy a house. But I don't see any mobilizing. If you were suddenly hired to sort of work for 6 months to make something happen, and what would you do? How would you mobilize around that kind of problem? Because it needs a solution.
Right.
It needs a lot of people are really struggling to find a home, to pay the rent, to pay a massive mortgage. How would you organize that?
Well, I mean, your first step is the question I referenced before, which is who are your people? And so you have to define your community.
So the people are homeless.
Yep.
They're people struggling with rent they can't afford. People struggling to find a place to rent at all, and people who want to buy a house and just can't afford to because it's 800,000 or whatever, crazy numbers.
And so, I would pick a place.
Okay.
And so whether it's, Vancouver or Victoria or so, I think
pick one community.
Start someplace.
Okay.
And you may not have a lot of money to begin with.
Yep.
And so you will definitely have to use the internet to, uncover your first wave of people.
Yep.
And then you need to give them, a pathway. And this is kind of a missing piece of a lot of campaigns as well, is people won't volunteer or donate money unless they think there's some
going somewhere or doing something.
Somewhere.
Yes.
So does this campaign have any promise to it? And so the art of the campaigning is you need to sort of lay out a narrative which is like, this is how we're going to win.
Yes, and this is what success looks like.
Yeah. And then if the person believes you, they'll say, hey, I believe that, so I'm going to give you 2 hours of my time, or I'm going to give you $20. And so you need to lay that out, and then you begin to recruit based on that pathway. And you say, 3 of us aren't going to change this problem, so how many people are we going to need to change this problem? And so you need to set yourself a target.
So I'm hearing that unless there's a clear pathway, you can see the pathway and see the result at the end. If it just gets all misty and vague, there's no motivation to do anything.
Yeah. People won't volunteer, or they'll, there's 20 other causes that are competing for their attention, so they'll go someplace else. Right?
So at the message level then, it is quite important to sort out a clear message. I mean, Trump clearly got a message, however simplistic it was, and people mobilized around Make America Great Again. Around the housing, if it was a campaign like the Civil Rights Movement, I'd have 3 words, and that represented the housing crisis, but they're not there, and no one's done that.
Yeah.
End homelessness addresses the street level thing, but it's much bigger than just homelessness.
Yeah, and that's possibly why it hasn't emerged, is because it is such a complicated issue.
Mm-hmm.
And so to simplify it in a way in which people actually believe that getting involved is going to make a difference.
So with your grant to organize this, would you take the top 10 organizations and put them take them off and take them to the woods for a weekend and lock them up and say, you can't go until you've got the solution and got it down in 2 words or 3 words?
I'm not sure I would do that. I'd probably start with the people who are hurting.
Okay.
And also,
they may not be if the housing problem is difficult to solve, they may not understand about financing and planning and.
Yeah, you'd be surprised. I mean, one of the models in the book is Acorn, and they organize low-income communities, not just on housing, but on a whole variety of issues. And they have.
Is that a Canadian group?
Yeah.
Acorn?
Well, they started in the States, but now Acorn Canada has over 100,000 members now.
100,000 members. How come I haven't heard of it before?
Well, yeah.
Maybe I'm so thick in the environmental movement, and that's the.
Partly it's because they are quite old school, and so they are not huge online. So they'll recruit going door to door.
Oh, right.
And so in some ways it's kind of invisible.
Yes.
But what they do well, to their great credit, is they take the people who are on the front lines of these problems, and they say, you guys are going to solve this problem. Like, we're not going to give you this on a silver platter, but we're going to work together with you, and together we'll do this.
Wow. Okay.
And then they put these people in positions of leadership. They say, you're going to form a chapter, like you're going to be the president of the local chapter, I'm not going to do this for you. And so the people who are the ones on the front lines are the ones in charge.
And because they're hurting, they've got motivation and persistence.
And moreover, and this is the big shocking thing about Acorn, is that they work with low-income people, and they self-finance through the low-income people donating.
How much do they donate typically?
Sometimes it's $15 a month, and these are people on with a low paycheck.
But $15 a month, that's like $150 a year membership.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
And they do it because they think it's going to improve their living conditions.
Right. Yeah.
And so they get tangible
it's
results.
Worthwhile investment.
Yeah. So they believe this is an investing in their own future. Let's go and do this together.
Because the current reality is that 2/3 of Canadians own property, or they have parents who own property, so they're going to inherit and use their inheritance to buy a house. 1/3 don't own property and don't have any parents who own property. They're never going to inherit. So this gap between owning and not owning is getting wider and wider, and you can see the whole country falling apart with frustration and anger and disempowerment and resentment. And
yeah. No, and then you have these weird demographics where poor people can't afford to live in Vancouver. I mean, there's no shortage of issues to tackle. I mean, part of the reason I wrote this book was I think I came. I've done a lot of years in campaigning, and I've probably lost more than I've won.
Yes.
And so I began to look at hard at what we were doing, saying, well, what would it take to win?
Yes.
And so that's why I wrote the book, was because I sort of went on a journey of discovery to say, okay, well, let's figure out what does work.
Are you engaged in any actual campaigns yourself at the moment?
Right now, I'm not. No. So I'm just finished this book and doing book promotion, as you're probably aware of that from your own work.
Yep.
But yeah, I'm open to getting involved in a campaign. I'm sort of looking for what the what the next big issues could be, whether it's housing, I'm also looking at sectors like the unions and the labor sector and thinking there's tons of potential there, I think, in terms of rediscovering organizing, and the unions have traditionally been sort of an engine of progressive social change in right around the world, but that hasn't been true lately.
Southwest Airlines in America, which is the most successful airlines, is also the most unionized airlines, and they have a lot of profit sharing and employee share owning.
Yep.
So they really have a participatory culture, and they see no conflict with being unionized in having success.
Yeah.
Whereas a lot of the mindset is, well, if your unions are going to make you a worse thing, which is kind of crazy, right? So we're running out of time. We've got 2 minutes left. I want to offer you the chance to talk straight to camera and share from your heart about. Did I forewarn you on this one? I think I did. But
you might have. But my partner would sort of balk at the fact of me talking from my heart, because I'm sort of a cerebral person.
Well.
There's
the camera there. Just talk straight to the viewer and share from your heart what needs to happen.
I think I wrote this book, as I just mentioned, because out of a sense that I didn't think we were making enough progress quickly enough. And so the question then becomes, how can you make more progress quickly? And one of the things I think we've forgotten as advocates is our fellow person, in terms of we can't just do this alone. We're not going to be able to, in many ways, think our way out of a paper bag here. Like we don't want to add another report to the shelf. We know, I think, we have enough knowledge to formulate smart solutions to things, but what we're missing in many ways is the political will. And we're confronting a lot of power structures, and those power structures often involve a lot of money. And so the only real antidote to that is people. People is really the only way that you can overcome a lot of the power structures and overcome a lot of that inertia. And so we need to rediscover, how do you actually organize? How do you bring people in to organizations and causes at scale? Not just a couple of people here and there, but I'm talking like hundreds of thousands of people. I do believe that people will get off the couch and will do things if they can see a pathway, if they believe it's going to be better for their lives and better for their communities. I think people will engage and will get active.
Does the proportional voting campaign that's going to start soon engage you at all, do you think? With the referendum coming up in about a year's time?
I mean, it's a fantastic opportunity to practice a lot of these things, because it cuts across a lot of sectors, and I think unions and NGOs alike could get involved in that. So it's a potential good model that we could.
Well, look, Matt, this is great. The book is Engagement Organizing: The Old Art and the New Science of Winning Campaigns. Thank you for putting it on. I know there's a lot of brain work gone into this and a lot of detailed research. So look, thank you for your leadership on this one. This has been the show called Change the World. My name's Guy Dauncey. And one of my contributions to changing the world is this book I've written called Journey to the Future, A Better World is Possible, which takes a lot of visionary ideas and puts them into a novel in Vancouver in the year 2032 to show what an amazing future it can be when we work on all this stuff together. If you like this kind of show, this kind of guest, tune in next week and you'll have some more scintillating conversations. And thank you for watching.